thought I'd start out with two quotes from Albert Einstein. The first to do with time. The distinction between past, present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Sounds very deep, I've got no idea what it means. But the second one, imagination is more important than knowledge, I do understand. And if you're going to work in the fossil record, a good imagination is a very important part of what you need in the armoury. Okay, as a starting point, if I had to pick a flag that I think best symbolises a nation, and if I had my best world and we could choose our own flag, I'd choose this one. There's obviously reasons why that might be a little bit difficult. But I start with this because the Aboriginal flag really does represent the land we live in as it stands. The black in the flag represents the Aboriginal people. The red at the bottom represents the red earth. And the yellow in the middle represents the sun, the giver of life and protector. And most people who think about Australia today think about it as a broad, flat, red land with very little vegetation. It wasn't always the way, and that's what I want to talk about tonight, is how we've gone from, or how we've arrived at this point, from a very different starting point. Plants are particularly interesting to look at when you're dealing with very long-term climate change, which is really the theme of what I'm going to talk about. I'm sure most of you are fully aware that plants power themselves via photosynthesis, a process whereby carbon dioxide and water are combined with light as an energy source to produce sugars, which the plants use, and oxygen as a waste product, which obviously makes our existence possible. The other interesting thing about plants is that they're almost always totally exposed to the environment. So unlike many animals, when conditions get tough, animals can hide away. Plants have to tough it out in the environment. So when you see long-term climate change, plants are a very good indicator of the kinds of responses you expect to see. They have to wear it. Okay, I thought about where to start this talk and decided I might as well start at the very beginning. So we'll begin with the origin of life. The fossil record isn't terribly useful in dealing with the origin of life. It's very good at dealing with the first evidence of life. There are researchers out there who spend their entire careers trying to figure out the origin of life, and they're making great strides. I decided to take the non-atheist approach and decide God did it. So we have God up here. It's quite interesting that someone who moves in mysterious ways, there's a lot of images of God on Google when you go looking, and that's a fairly typical one. God traditionally is middle-aged or a bit older, male, big hair, big beard, lots of flowing robes. This particular image is one of a very wise, intelligent and good-looking God because of the male pattern baldness. So the fossil record itself starts with the simplest possible organisms. Prokaryotic organisms, they still exist today, bacteria and many other organisms. They really do make up the bulk of diversity on Earth, but you just don't see them because they're so small. In the very earliest rocks where you'd expect to find life, these organisms are present. And from then on we have a fairly understandable evolution of life. If you move on a fraction, photosynthesis evolved very early in unicellular prokaryotes, the very earliest forms of life. So photosynthesis was one of the very early features of life. And then a really important event took part, which made possible the evolution of multicellular life and eventually our existence. And that is that over a long period of time, some prokaryotic cells, very simple cells, ingested others and probably for a long time simply ate them effectively, digested them down. But in some cases they didn't. They were ingested but they weren't digested, and they became organelles inside a new kind of cell which is called a eukaryote, this term here. And eukaryotes are much more complex cells with organelles inside them and eventually made possible the evolution of complex life. And so here, from a plant perspective, we had a cell with lots of organelles in it, some of which were able to undergo photosynthesis, and they originated as bacteria over here. There's evidence in Australia of very old forms of life. Perhaps the most spectacular is stromatolites. Stromatolites still exist in Shark Bay. Here they are at low tide and here they are underwater. And if you go back to some of the very oldest rocks on Earth, you can see stromatolites here, also in Western Australia. And these laminations you can see, this one's been split down the middle, represent the layers where these tiny unicellular organisms gathered up towards the surface so they could gather light and undergo photosynthesis. And these are some of the best evidence we have of very early photosynthesis on Earth. And remarkably, they still exist today. So this had a really important impact on early Earth. This is a graph which goes into gigayears. So this is 4 billion years, 3 billion years, and so on. And it's obviously very rough. And 100 here is 100%. So this is oxygen levels in the atmosphere as they are today. And you can see the slow build-up. And it starts at very low levels indeed, effectively close to zero oxygen on Earth. So the oxygen we have in the Earth today, around 21% of the atmosphere, is almost entirely due to photosynthesis. And so plants producing a waste product out of photosynthesis have made possible the evolution of most animal life. The early green plants that were multicellular were marine algae. Here's an example of one today, Caulerpa. And marine algae like this have a relatively easy life. They have to live close to the ocean surface so they can get enough light. Light is lost very quickly down through a water column, but up near the surface, algae can exist quite happily. They're in water, so they take their carbon dioxide out of the water. It's dissolved in the water. The plant can take carbon dioxide anywhere on this plant body. It can diffuse into the plant itself, undergo photosynthesis, and oxygen is given back out into the water body. Then around 425 million years ago, the first plants appeared on land. And fortunately, these first plants are exactly what you'd expect them to look like. They're as simple as you can imagine a plant being. So they're things called Cooksonia, named after Isabel Cookson, who was a botanist at the University of Melbourne. Very simple things. Whenever they branched, it was into two equal halves, and you can see that continuing on. Their sporangia, where they reproduced, were at the termination of these branches. And the entire plant was about 3 centimetres high. So they're tiny little plants that just crept out onto land. And when they did this, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were about 15 times higher than they are now. So they didn't need a lot of area to capture light because there was a lot of carbon dioxide around for them to use in photosynthesis. These plants had a problem compared to plants growing in the ocean. They were no longer surrounded by water, so they could very easily dehydrate. The way they got around the problem was the most amazing solution, and it's gone straight through to plants that are alive today with almost no change. They developed these tiny little turgor-operated valves. It's like having a pair of jelly beans, if you think about what jelly beans look like, facing each other, and when you do that, there's a hole in the middle, and that hole in the middle allows gas to get in, so carbon dioxide can get into the leaf. It also allows gases to get out, so the oxygen, which is a waste product for plants, can get back out. The rest of the surface here is covered in wax, so that there's very little gas penetration. It all happens through these pores. If you look at that in section, you've got the two cells here. Water is getting out and oxygen is getting out, carbon dioxide is getting in and coming over to these specialist cells where it undergoes photosynthesis. The way this works, more or less, is that these cells are open when they're full of water. So when there's plenty of water in the environment, the plant's got plenty of water, the stomates swell up, they fill up, become turgid, then the pore opens. As the plant dries out, you go into drought conditions, the cells lose their water and they lose their turgor and they come together and the pore closes up. It's a very clever mechanism. Plants will die from lack of water on land more than from any other cause. And so the best thing they can do is make sure they've got a protection mechanism when drought comes. These little pores close up and keep the water inside the plant body as well as they can. When there's plenty of water around, they open up and photosynthesis carries on. These very earliest Cooksonias had stomates. There's the pair of cells there, that's the pore just there. And you can see in these modern plants it's not really changed at all. So we move forward about 50 million years and we find all of a sudden plants have gone from being 3 centimetres tall to being trees. And they're trees with quite significant leaf area on them. And the main reason for this evolution is twofold, really. They became trees mostly because there were a lot more plants beginning to develop on land, and competition for light immediately became a problem. Plants shading each other is a real issue. And so plants get taller to try and get to the light. That's why trees are trees. So they can get up and try and get taller than the plants around them. It's the only earthly reason you can imagine why you'd put all that effort into producing a big woody trunk, is to just be taller than everything else. At the same time, they developed quite a significant leaf area because they had a lot more plant body to look after, and also because the carbon dioxide levels have dropped about tenfold from where they started back when Cooksonia first made its entrance. Okay, now we'll move forward some distance to get onto the main story that I have to tell. The origin of flowering plants. Flowering plants, or angiosperms, represent probably the most significant event in plant history. Charles Darwin, who also had male pattern baldness, you might notice here, called the origin of angiosperms an abominable mystery. And it's really only in the last 20 years that we've come close to understanding how, when, where and why angiosperms evolved. It really did create a lot of headaches for a long time, and even now we don't have the full story, but it's certainly improved a lot in the last few years. So where? If you sort of reconstruct the world as it was around 120 to 145 million years ago, it's on the equator in this sort of Brazil, West Africa, up into the Middle East. That's where the earliest evidence of flowering plants is found, and from this area they migrated out all over the earth. It took them 10 million years to reach Antarctica. They didn't exactly burst out from that point of origin. What did the earliest flowering plants look like? When I grew up, when I was a student here, generally plants like magnolia were regarded as the most primitive flowering plants. So we had this version of big woody plants with big showy flowers that were insect pollinated, usually beetles, and they produced big reproductive structures, this fossil here. And this is a reconstruction of one of the early angiosperms that's really well understood. And if anyone knows the tulip tree, Liriodendron, these really bizarre leaves with their emarginate apexes are exactly like living Liriodendron, and that's what these fossils had on them. So for a long time, this was the prevailing wisdom. This is how early flowering plants were. But no longer is that the belief, because there's now a whole new story about what the earliest flowering plants looked like. These people, Elsie Fries here and her husband, Carl Pedersen, and Peter Crane, Sir Peter Crane these days, these people cracked the story, basically, of what the early angiosperms were really doing. And these, in my view, are the cream of the paleobotanical world. The work they've done is just astonishing. What they discovered was that if you went to some of the sand deposits in the Northern Hemisphere and you were very patient and looked very hard, you could recover these tiny reproductive structures. Look at the size of these things, 1.1 millimetres wide. This one's 1.3 millimetres wide. And look at what they are here. This is the fossil. This is a living Quintinia. This is a fossil. This is another living Quintinia. This is a fossil with 3 stamens only. The whole flower it's a male flower, just 3 stamens. Here's a living plant with just 3 stamens. These are tiny herbaceous plants that tiny little plants near the ground with really tiny flowers and fruits. These were the earliest angiosperms, not these big showy magnolias. It's these tiny little herbaceous things. It's an amazing breakthrough. And they're now finding them all over the world. In the fossil record, almost always you find what you look for. Once you know what to look for, you see it. If you don't know what you're looking for, you just can pass it by very easily. Here's another example. This is some work that's just about to be published from Peter Raven. And I put this up here because it does demonstrate we occasionally get into high-tech science here. This is a scanning electron microscope shot of a flower bud that's about 85 million years old. A similar flower bud under, and I've got to read this, synchrotron radiation X-ray tomographic microscopy. Using the synchrotron, They've managed to take sections through this, and in fact they've got videos which effectively take you from the base of the bud right up to the top, and you can see where the seeds are going to develop. In the 3 locules, you can see the stamens out here, you can see the individual petals. This is an 85 million year old plant that's only 1 millimetre in diameter, and you get that kind of detail inside it. So, and of course non-destructively. You're doing this by a process that keeps the fossil intact. So what was the ecology of these early plants? Well, we know they were disturbance-based. They really liked a lot of disturbance in the environment, and when that occurred, they thrived. One of the early ideas about how the disturbance came about was that the dinosaurs did it. So you have these herbivorous dinosaurs, short front legs, big browsing snouts here so they can get down close to the ground, and when a herd of these goes thundering through the vegetation, they make a mess. So you get the disturbance that you need, and these tiny little herbaceous angiosperms will quickly come in behind and vegetate the landscape. Modern elephants on occasions do the same thing, come by in herds and just trash the vegetation, and you get all kinds of weedy small species coming in behind them. But that's not the story that's best understood right now. This is the really important part of this story, and I think the most interesting thing that still has a lot of work required to be done. Most of the early fossils of these tiny herbaceous flowering plants, all the ones that I showed you, share one important feature. They're all charcoal. They've all been burnt. So even though they're so exquisitely preserved, they've been through a fire and they are charcoal. Fire clearly played a critical role in the early flowering plant evolution and in their rise to prominence in the vegetation. And this is a really interesting point. If you're going to have a fire, you need 3 things. You need an ignition source, and this is the most likely one. You need significant amounts of fuel, and that fuel has to be dry enough to burn. This is the really important issue. How dry is dry enough for fuel to burn? And you've got to take yourself out of a modern context here and look at past conditions. How dry is dry enough depends entirely on how much oxygen there is in the atmosphere. So if you look at this diagram, and forget the line on it for the moment, just look at the coloured sections. Here's the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere from 0 to 40%. At the moment we sit at about 21%, this green line through here. If you have less than about 13% oxygen in the atmosphere, you can't start a fire. It just won't burn. You can't strike a match. If you go between about 13 and 16%, you can have fires, but only in the driest conditions, and they're rare. Then you get into the kind of conditions we have today, between about 17 or 18% up to about 23, 24%. You have conditions that we're familiar with today and that we live in. If you go into about 26 to 30%, you have extreme fire. All vegetation will ignite. If you light a match in a rainforest during a thunderstorm, the vegetation will burn when you've got oxygen levels as high as that. If you go above 30%, you have no terrestrial vegetation. Plants can't survive. And we've been in all those places in the past. So the conditions we live in today that we understand don't represent most of what the past has been like. And you can see that here in this reconstruction of oxygen levels, that actually through all this time, most of the time we've been in this yellow band where you have extreme fire and all vegetation will ignite. And when these flowering plants were coming into place here, that was the situation. They were living in a place where oxygen levels were high enough that fire was extremely likely to happen, even in quite wet conditions. So it's just a totally different, you need a totally different mindset to what we have if we look at vegetation from a modern perspective. And you can see, of course, here we've dropped down into present levels in more recent time. If you look at that last bit in more detail, I'm heading towards the Australian situation here. You can see that around about 60 million years ago, there's a quite distinct drop. This is a graph that tells you how much charcoal you find in fossil deposits. And in the living vegetation, the answer is about 0.5 on average. So if you're above that, then you've got higher fire frequencies than today. Below that, you're in lower fire frequencies. So you can see that we dropped into a period of time here around 40 million years ago where fires were relatively rare. Now that was matched by a decrease in atmospheric oxygen, but there must have been some other things involved, and at least in the Australian situation we understand fairly well what they were. This is a graph of two things. The temperature here, which certainly got to very high levels. 0 is the baseline for today. Very high levels here. More importantly, I think, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's an interesting thing. We're sitting today at about 400 parts per million, this green broken line. Look at the levels back here, and this is without error bars. Of course, some of these measurements are not terribly precise. I've left the error bars off simply to make the diagrams easier to visualise. There are very high error bars back here. It could have been even much higher than this. But there have been times in the past where the world has lived in much higher atmospheric carbon dioxide levels than we have today. That has a really interesting impact for plants, because not only does this have a greenhouse effect and dramatically change the climate, but it also dramatically changes the amount of carbon dioxide available for photosynthesis, and so potentially you get much higher growth rates in the plants. Then in the world of ocean circulation, there's also an important point to be made here about the way the world was. In the southern hemisphere, the continents have moved around remarkably over the last few tens of millions of years. So if we go back 34 million years ago, South America is connected to Antarctica. This is Antarctica here, the Antarctic Peninsula as it was to become here, South America. Australia is connected to Antarctica over here. And as a result, the ocean currents that we understand today, where the southern hemisphere is dominated by the circumantarctic current, didn't exist. And it couldn't exist because there was land in the way. So what you had instead was ocean currents which basically circulated water from high latitudes up to the equator and back again, and it did it all over the place. So you've got water circulating from the equator to the pole, not just circulating around the pole itself. That's a really important phenomenon in terms of the climate that you get, because when the water's at the equator, the sun is directly overhead most of the time. There's a relatively small amount of atmosphere that solar radiation has to get through to heat the water. And so the ocean at the equator is relatively hot. That very large amount of oceanic water then goes down to high latitudes and stays relatively warm. So you have a very small temperature gradient between the equator and the pole. But when you're down at the pole, the atmosphere is the same thickness, but the sun's sitting over here somewhere, so it's got this much atmosphere to get through. So very little solar radiation gets through the atmosphere at the high latitudes. The water stays relatively cold. It doesn't have the solar radiation to pick up that it can get at the equator. So when Australia and Antarctica separate from Australia and South America separate from Antarctica, you develop an ocean current around Antarctica. This water never has the benefit of the sun overhead to heat it up. It gets cold, an ice cap starts to form. An ice cap has very high albedo, it's white, it reflects light, so not much solar radiation stays in the region. It gets even colder, so more ice forms. And before you know it, you're in a runaway situation where you form the Antarctic ice cap. It's then very cold at high latitudes and relatively warm still at the equator. So the difference in temperature from the equator to the pole is much greater today than it was 34 million years ago. I mean, this is 16 million years ago, but it hasn't changed much through to the present day in terms of the general concept. And so if you go back when continents were all joined together in the southern hemisphere, there were rainforests with trees on Antarctica because it was warm down there, mostly because of the ocean currents, but also the very high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels with their greenhouse effect. And there are trees that are in their growth position in Antarctica, and you can reconstruct the spacing of the trees in Antarctica in the forests that occurred there. There are places in the southern hemisphere today, like New Caledonia, and Australia is the same, where there are individual trees, this is an Araucaria, that don't realise that they've left Antarctica. They think they're still there. And they think they're still there because they're very tall and all the canopy is down the sides of the tree. If you're growing in Antarctica and the sun is always on the horizon, it tracks around the horizon all day during summer, it never goes overhead, you need all the canopy down the side of the tree because that's where you're going to capture the light for photosynthesis. If you're in the tropics, you need all the canopy on top of the tree because the sun's going overhead every day. This is all about how you best capture light. And we know these trees have close relatives in the Antarctic fossil record. They're very conservative plants. This is Oricaria, which in Adelaide you best know from Norfolk Island pine trees that are used as street trees down along the beach. Not quite as extreme as this, but they do the same thing if you have a look at them. And Antarctica itself, up to about 35 million years ago, what is today the Transantarctic Mountains, would have looked like this. This is a photograph taken in the Andes, but we know from the fossil record that this is pretty much what Antarctica looked like just prior to the separation of the major continents from Antarctica itself. Whoops. So at that time, if we come into Australia now, southern Australia, in fact around Adelaide, would have looked something like this. Dense, diverse, ultra-wet rainforest. If you want to find a place on Earth that's the best model for this today, it's mid-montane New Guinea. That's still not perfect, but it's the best we get, with some significant differences. Until about 50 million years ago, there were some really unusual plants sitting in these forests, things that you'd never expect to see in these sorts of forests today. Particular kinds of cycads, ginkgos, seed ferns, which are globally extinct now, and conifers. Only a few of these plants survived beyond about 45 million years ago. There's also some evidence of flowering plants that were ancestral to some of our prominent living plant groups, and some of them are quite a surprise. I'll just give you a couple of examples here. Ginkgo, most of you I'm sure will know what a ginkgo looks like. This is living ginkgo from China. There's only one living species. I hope you can pick that out, but there's a fossil ginkgo leaf from Tasmania at about 40 million years ago, 45 maybe. That's a plant which is obviously now extinct in the southern hemisphere. There's a cycad, one of the very first really important fossil plants I found, and I put my pick through the top of it here, which is why it's very painstakingly reconstructed. It's an extinct genus, quite possibly an extinct family. What's really interesting about this, it's from Victoria. The base of the cycad has got this swollen piece here, and this looks like a clean abscission zone. Now, only one living cycad sheds its fronds cleanly, and it does that in response to drought. This is a cycad that was growing in Victoria when Victoria was connected to Antarctica and they were living in winter darkness. There's every chance this is a winter deciduous cycad, and it shed its fronds clean during winter. I've sat looking at that for 30 years and I can't figure out a way to try and prove that. I'm still thinking about it. Here's another really interesting plant that will certainly strike a chord with some of you. This is a plant called Paraphatia subpeltata. There's its point of attachment. It's got these huge lobes that run out from here. It's from a sand quarry down at Maslin Bay. It took us a very long time, decades, to figure this out, but this plant is a morphological link between the Proteaceae, which is a really important southern hemisphere family, Banksias, Dryandras, Proteas themselves, and the Platanaceae, the plane trees that line Adelaide streets. A northern hemisphere plant which has a love-hate relationship with people in Adelaide. It's a really interesting thing that when the molecular biologists got hold of plant phylogeny, looking at plant history, they discovered that the nearest living relatives to Proteaceae is Platanaceae. And then we found this fossil which appears to be a link between the two. Not intuitive at all, I have to say. Then there are groups of plants that we find in southern Australia that really do demonstrate how different the climate was. This is an especially interesting plant. It's the only mangrove palm. It's a thing called Nipa. Here it is. This is salt water, and here you can see these palms along the water's edge. They now grow in a fairly restricted area in the tropics. We've found fronds, fruits, pollen grains, that's what these are, as far south as Tasmania, as long ago as 50 million years. So here is where Nipa occurs today, in this shaded region. These are the records from the Northern Hemisphere, but there's this Tasmanian record, which is far enough away as it is, but you have to put Tasmania back down here to appreciate where it was really growing 50 million years ago. So by about 45 million years ago, we had complex rainforest present in southern Australia. We would have recognised it, but it certainly would have looked out of place geographically. We would have expected to find it in New Guinea in the tropics. So what did we have that allowed that to occur? And I've pretty much told you all of this. An extinct climate, which includes ever wet conditions, very high atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, really strange high latitude photoperiods, strange in the sense of rainforest growing in them. Those photoperiods still exist today, but very little grows in them in the southern hemisphere. And possibly high natural disturbance regimes, but not fire. It was just not the right conditions for fire to thrive. Since that time, there's been significant extinction of these plants. There's been some range changes. These plants have followed particular climates. But interestingly enough, we see few examples of clear evolutionary change. So there haven't been major evolutionary events in plants in the last 40 million years in the southern hemisphere, from my perspective. In some vegetation types there must have been, but in the fossil record we can't find them. So you see things like this, and again these are some of the very early fossil plants I dealt with in my career. The Maslin Bay flora is basically a typical tropical rainforest. Lots of entire margin, fairly nondescript looking leaves. This was the site I did my PhD on in New South Wales. This is a tropical vine leaf. It's not hard, I think, to convince you of that. In the family Menispermaceae. Today they're all tropical climbers. We can tell that it was extraordinarily wet because on the surface of these leaves you have these tiny fungi that grow all kinds of different morphologies, and we know today that you only find these fungi in the very wettest parts of the planet, and you never see them at the density that you see them in these fossils. It was wetter in these sites than anywhere on Earth today. So then Australia separated from Antarctica, and Australia really began to change, and that's the bit I want to deal with next. What happened after Australia separated from Antarctica, started heading towards the equator, and really for much of that journey was all on its own. It's not easy to find a way to explain what happened to these plants, so I'm going to do it by a series of examples. I'm going to look at the nearest living relatives of the fossils that used to be in southern Australia and show you where they occur today and how much things have changed. So for example, we've got one group of plants that were present in southern Australia that today you only find up near the equator. A really good example of that is this plant called Gymnostoma. It's in the Casuarinaceae. There's casuarinas all over South Australia, but this is the tropical form. There's one population of this genus in Australia on the Atherton tableland in about a hectare of forest. Otherwise it's in New Guinea and New Caledonia. It has these typical casuarina-like cones. There's a fossil. It has these photosynthetic branches. These are all fossils here. There's a male inflorescence as a fossil. Still got pollen inside the stamens. We've got lots of examples of this in southern Australia, and it's now very much restricted to the tropics. And there's many other examples. The Lauraceae, a huge family of 3,000 plus species. They get down almost to the Victorian border, but the great diversity of this family is in the tropics. And it was common right down through Tasmania and all through southern Australia 35 million years ago. A second group of plants have also moved north in Australia, but they've left descendants in place in southern Australia. In every case that you find these, the descendant which is left behind in southern Australia has very small leaves, in this case Nothofagus cunninghamii, compared to the species that grows in northern Australia, in this case Nothofagus morii. The fossil record that we have looks like the big leaf version. So this is the derived species. This is what's evolved in the last 35 million years. And this is a temperature effect. This is a response to low temperature, getting smaller leaves. Just to show that I do numbers occasionally. These are leaf areas. And you can see we've taken, just to pick an example, Acridenia. There's a species in New South Wales that has leaves that are nearly 10,000 square millimetres. The Tasmanian species is only 750. You can see the pairs down there. I won't go through them all. This is the Nothofagus example I just showed you. The southern species occurs in Victoria and Tasmania. We also grew them in glasshouses to see how much of it was genetically fixed, and the answer is most of it is genetically fixed. It's not something that changes when you grow them under identical conditions. A third group of these fossils, the nearest living relatives, are found today at similar latitudes to southern Australia, but they're gone from Australia. So you find them in New Zealand or in South America at about the same latitudes as Adelaide, for instance, but they're gone from Australia. This is a classic example here, this Nothofagus. It's got very unusual reproductive structures. It only occurs in South America. It only has a fossil record in Australia. Fitzroya. Fitzroya, if there weren't sequoias and sequoiadendrons in North America, this would be a very famous tree. These are huge, these trees. They're about 50 metres tall. They get up to 5 metres in diameter at the base. They're magnificent trees which have been largely logged out in South America. There's only one species, Fitzroya cuprossoides. It produces foliage like this, and these are the cones. And it only has a fossil record in one place in the world, and that's Tasmania. There's no fossil record in South America. Then there's a fourth group that contains species that are more or less unchanged in southern Australia, and everything's happened around them, and they haven't moved, and they haven't changed the way they look. There's very few species in this group, but there are some. Kingbilly pine, Aethrotaxis in Tasmania. These get up to about 4 metres in diameter at the base. They're magnificent trees. Again, largely, the big trees are largely logged out. Nothofagus gunnii, Australia's only winter deciduous native species. That's it during autumn. Tend to be small shrubby plants. And Phyllocladus, a conifer, which is utterly bizarre in so many ways. I'll come back to Phyllocladus a bit later and you can see it in a bit more detail. These are all long-term southern survivors that have just toughed out all the changes in conditions. There's a fifth group, which is plants that used to occur in southern Australia and are now globally extinct. This is an Oricaria or Oricaria-like plant. That's the base there. That's the leaf right across to there. It's about 25 centimetres long. There's nothing, this is the close relative to Norfolk Island pine, which has got leaves about 1 centimetre long. There's nothing that even remotely approaches this. It's very much a hangover from very long ago. These are the stomates taken with a scanning electron microscope from the inside of the leaf. So rainforests were extensive across much of Australia until 35 million years ago, and then things changed. Why did they change? Well, rainfall became more seasonal, it declined annually, and eventually it became unreliable across much of Australia. Interestingly, one of the things that isn't intuitive is that the summer-winter rainfall boundary moved north faster than Australia did. So today we sit in summer dry periods, it rains in winter. If you go north in Australia, they have rain in summer and it's dry in winter. That boundary, which is somewhere around Sydney kind of latitude, has not always been in that place. That boundary used to be south of Australia. So all of Australia had summer rainfall. If Adelaide had summer rainfall, we'd have very different vegetation. The vegetation around southern Australia is dry and miserable at times and difficult because we have a very hot, dry summer. If we had a very hot, wet summer, it'd be completely different. Temperatures have changed, and most importantly, the temperature extremes have increased. The main reason for the increase in temperature extremes is the decline in rainfall. So you don't have all these masses of water vapour in the atmosphere dampening the temperatures. And as a result of these climate changes, fire increased in significance again. So we used to have a very fire-prone world. We've gone back to one, but for different reasons. We haven't had the rise in oxygen levels. Other things have happened that have caused the problems. This is one of the possible reasons for the change in the summer-winter rainfall boundary. There's this subtropical high-pressure system which controls the position of that boundary. 20 million years ago, it was probably south of Australia, but it's moved northwards faster than Australia has, so now it sits about here. And it controls the boundary to about those latitudes across there. The impact of a drying climate is best shown in Australia by having a look at conifers. We'll move away from flowering plants for a moment. Just very quickly, I'll go through this. Conifers, there are very few conifers in Australia today that are native. There were hundreds of them in the past. This is a thing called acmopile. There's a fossil of the same thing that's about 50 million years old. Today, acmopile has 2 species, one on a single mountaintop in New Caledonia and one restricted to 10 trees in Fiji. It's extraordinarily rare. It was common across southern Australia around 40 to 50 million years ago. Phyllocladus again, I mentioned earlier, that's looking down on a Phyllocladus plant. These are not true leaves, they're flattened branch systems that have taken over the function of leaves. This is a fossil of the same thing, very obviously. A thing called Libocedrus, this is a New Caledonian species. When it produces the cones, only the New Caledonian species produce these long spine-like protuberances. Here they are in a fossil from Tasmania 35 million years ago. I've got no idea how they got to New Caledonia from Tasmania. The fossil diversity of conifers in southern Australia was extreme. Now, I won't go through this table in detail, but look at one example. These are the 3 major families, Oricariaceae, Cupressaceae, Podocarpaceae. In the southern hemisphere, that makes up almost all the conifers. This is the number of species and the number of genera in brackets next to them that they occur in. This site here, Little Rapid River, 35 million years ago, had 26 conifer species in 14 genera. No site on Earth in any place or any time back through history has had a higher diversity than that. That's the most conifer diverse vegetation the Earth has ever seen. But it all went to hell in a handbasket. Partly, I think, because of rainfall, and you can prove this quite clearly. This is a plot of past water availability. This is the present day is 0, that's the baseline. And you can see back here 20 million years ago and up to about 14 to 15 million years ago, there was a lot more water available than there is today. Then it started to plummet. There are 3 things named after me in the literature, and they're all things that we don't know about. The Hill Gap here is actually, because I pointed out that there was a period of time that we know nothing about, I got it named after me and we still don't know anything about it. And then we went into a transition into the glaciations here of wildly fluctuating conditions. And so what happened to these conifers? One of my very talented PhD students a long time ago, Tim Brodrib, did some really excellent work on living conifers where he looked at the dry season rainfall they grow in, and this is logarithmic, so 10, 100, 1,000 millimetres as the dry season rainfall when they were under most pressure, and their water use efficiency. The water use efficiency is really a measure of how much water a plant loses per unit of carbon dioxide that it picks up in photosynthesis. And obviously the drier the conditions, the more plants care about that. When it gets dry, they worry about how much water they lose. Well, they don't worry about anything, but they react to how much water they lose. If you think about it, this is a whole lot of species that currently grow in the Australasian region with one African species here thrown in. And it's a very good relationship that tells you that the dry season rainfall greatly impacts on how well they use water. No surprise in that really, but it's a great relationship. If you compare this to the fossil record and to the living distribution, you can see that the ones right up the top here in the wettest conditions are the ones that went extinct first because Australia started drying out. Then you have the group that only occur in the most restricted wet habitats in Tasmania. Then you get some that are in Victoria in slightly broader habitats, then the semi-arid ones, then the arid ones. This is really an extinction record of the past and potentially the future as the climate in Australia dries out. And I suspect there's another group that sat out here, which are the ones that we know are globally extinct. They've gone all together, so you can't find them to do the experiments on them. But if you could, my guess is they'd sit out here. So then we get towards the end. As Australia dried out, an even more interesting interaction took place between soil nutrients and water availability. And this is really significant in understanding the Australian vegetation today. I'll move through this fairly quickly, but things like Banksias evolved at this time. There's Banksia cones in the fossil record here and here, very obviously. as long as 45 million years ago. There's things that look like Banksia leaves. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's a section of a leaf here with these really deeply divided leaves. Here's a living Banksia for comparison. There's fossils in Western Australia of all kinds of Proteaceae that are clearly reacting to low nutrient and low water availability. And all of this led to an increase in fuel and an increase in the likelihood that fuel would burn because it was dry. So today Australian plants can be categorised as either fire intolerant, fire resistant or fire promoting. And as we all know, fire is very much an important part of the Australian landscape today. Fire intolerant vegetation tends to occur in rainforests or in alpine conditions. If they burn, they're stuffed. Basically, they can't recover, they're gone. That fire occurred about 40 years before that photograph was taken. Fire-resistant vegetation, there's lots of strategies. Xanthorrhoeas flower after fire, so they produce masses of seed which get into the landscape when there's a lot of nutrients around from the burnt material from the fire, so they get a head start in the next generation. Banksias tend to release seed from their woody fruits after a fire, so they can also germinate and recover. And then there's fire-promoting vegetation, and the king of the fire promoters is eucalyptus. It's got all sorts of strategies that allow it to survive fire vegetatively. They get these epicormic shoots. It has woody fruits that will protect the seeds from the heat of the fire. Eucalypts actually do best when there's a lot of fire around, more so than most other plants in Australia. We can reconstruct the fire record for Australia from the Latrobe Valley coal. So David Blackburn here did this work about 30 years ago in this university. And he showed that the very early vegetation in Australia, 20 to 30 million years ago, in the driest conditions, we had Banksias, Calitris, Casuarinas, and there was fire present. The fire was intense, but it wasn't very frequent. It didn't happen very often. And I mean, if you want to talk about fire management, this is a really critical issue today that isn't properly understood in the living environment. Fossil eucalyptus is surprisingly rare in Australia, frustratingly rare. The best fossil eucalypts and the oldest fossil eucalypts are from Patagonia in South America. And they are just magnificent. There's leaves, which are eucalypts. There's flower buds. There's flowers where you can see the stigma and the stamens. There's fruits. It's embarrassingly good from an Australian perspective. But the interesting question here is, how did eucalyptus become extinct in South America, not why did it occur there in the first place? We have eucalypt fossils in Australia. There are some leaves. They're not as old as the South American ones. There are some fruits that are only about 25 million years old by comparison to those 52 million year old ones. But it's surprisingly difficult to find eucalyptus in Australia. There's a whole story behind that, which I haven't got time to go into, but it certainly is an indication of how important fire has become in recent times, and possibly since the arrival of humans into Australia. And so to finish, or to head quickly towards a completion, where are we now and where are we heading? Here's 400,000 years worth of record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 300 parts per million. In the last 400,000 years, we effectively have not gone past that level, and it's usually been well below it. And then you have this straight line at the end, which takes us to 397 parts per million. When I drew this graph about 3 weeks ago, most of you will be aware that on the weekend we passed 400 parts per million, which really makes no difference out there on a daily basis, but if you're interested in big numbers, it should attract people's attention. It's a particularly frightening place for us to be. If you look at the impact of this and the cause, anyone who says this doesn't have a human cause is daydreaming. This graph shows in black the rise in human population since the start of the Industrial Revolution, when there was about 1 billion people. We've now gone up here to about 7. There are the 3 potential scenarios for the future from the United Nations, depending on how optimistic you are. And plotted against that, the red line on this axis over here is the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So if you don't think those two things are somehow linked, then I'd be interested to hear what you think might have been going on. Should we be worried? Well, we should be. Should plants be worried? Well, no, not really. I mean, there'll be extinctions, yes, But plants will cope, plants will survive, and as carbon dioxide rises, they'll simply roll with the punches. We can do a lot of damage, and we will before this is all over, but the damage will be far greater to us in the long run than it will be to the plants. If we get rid of all the ice on Earth, the Sydney Harbour Bridge roadway is sea level. Nearly 70 metres of sea level rise. That won't happen this century because even if all the ice was set free now and began melting, it can't melt this century. But if it is set free, if the Greenland ice sheet sets itself free, it will melt. And even the Greenland ice sheet is 6 metres of sea level rise. Plants will find a way to get through that. Whether we do is a much more interesting question. I was asked, and I will plug the Faculty of Sciences eScience magazine. If any of you are interested in this or other science topics, that's a really good place to go. It's a free resource available on the web or by iPad. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.